I now want to shift. The book shifts abruptly at one point to the terrible events that occurred. I think part of the skill of Fethiye's writing is that you have a warm portrait of a family, warts and all, and so in a way it prepares you to understand the calamity, I think, with greater depth, and I wanted to ask, were there hints when you were younger that there was a story around? It's quite extraordinary that at the age of 20 you began hearing the story, but there must have been some sign earlier that something terrible had happened.
1915 ile ilişkin hiçbir fikrimiz yoktu. Ders kitaplarında buna ilişkin bir şey yoktu. Benim çocukluğumda.
During my growing up years, I didn't know anything about 1915. There wasn't any mention in the, subject books or reference books at school about 1915 also.
Tarih kitaplarında bize öğrettikleri tarihe göre Türkler, yani bizim atalarımız, Orta Asya'dan çıkmışlar.
And the history books refer to, our forefathers, the Turkish. They came from the Middle East.
Ve dünyanın her tarafına yayılarak her tarafa aslında medeniyeti götürmüşler.
And that they started spreading all around the world, and as they spread it, they also spread the modernization.
Ve tabii ki Anadolu topraklarına da gelip orada bir tarih oluşturmuşlar. Bize anlatılan buydu.
And that they came to the Anatolian land and they started having their history. This was the history that we were taught.
Bizdeki tarih eğitimi gerçekten bir tarih bilinci vermekten çok uzak. Çünkü aile tarihlerini, içinde bulunduğumuz yerel tarihi bilmeden, öğrenmeden büyüyoruz biz.
The history that we're taught is, different. The history is not told about the families or the environment that you're living out or the province that you're from.
O yüzden bu bilgiler bizim için ezberlenecek şeylerdi. Ezberleyip unutuyorduk. Çevremizdeki şeyleri anlamlandıramıyorduk.
The information was, it's to do with just remembering it, and then you forget what you remembered, because it didn't reflect to your environment.
I think one of the things I want to look at some of the bigger themes that come out of this, and which will come up perhaps in our discussions later on when we get together in our smaller groups. But the first thing I wanted to look at was this issue of how do you listen to these stories? How can you listen to these stories of such horror? And at one point, Fethiye writes, "It was hard to keep myself from running out into the street to cry and scream." And I wanted to explore a little bit this issue of how you receive these stories and the impact that it has.
Öğrendiğim andan itibaren içimde bir isyan duygusu oluştu. Geceleri özellikle uyuyamadığımı fark ettim ve hep böyle sokaklara çıkıp bağırmak istiyordum.
When I first found out, had that rebellious, connotations, and that at nights I would just wanted to go out to the streets and scream as loud as that I could.
Bize yalan söylüyorlar diye bağırmak.
Us lies. This was what I want to scream out.
Sanıyorum kandırılmış olmak hissi bana çok ağır geliyordu.
That it was difficult to understand, to be lied to and being lied.
Bunu herkesle paylaşmak istiyordum.
That I wanted to share this with everyone.
Ayrıca anneannemin Ermeni olmasını öğrenmek bende Ermenilere ve diğer azınlıklara bakış açısını değiştirdi.
And when I found out about my grandmother being an Armenian, but sort of this did to me was to look at the Armenian and the other minority groups with a different eye.
O ana kadar fark etmediğim pek çok şeyi fark etmeme yol açtı.
Yeah, that it made me recognize things that I haven't recognized or reflected before.
Okuduğum ve baktığım her şey benim için farklılaştı.
And then for everything that I read and everything that I started seeing was different and diverse to me from that point on.
Bu arada kendimle olan kavgam da başladı.
And at the same time, the fight that I had with myself started.
Onu da açıklayayım. Örneğin
I'll explain.
bizde bazı sözcükler vardır. Yani dil çok önemli burada tabii. O sözcüklerde gayrimüslimleri aşağılayan bazı şeyler kullanılır. Örneğin gavur denir.
There's, sort of, as an example, there are, sort of words that was expressed, sort of that we would express, and that would, sort of discriminate or recriminate against, sort of certain groups, like those people who are not Muslims, that we would call them the word gavur.
Örneğin ağır bir şey için gavur acısı gibi ağır derler.
So for example, something that's really heavy to lift, you would call that a gavur's death, sort of.
O andan itibaren o dilimize yerleşmiş o ayrımcı sözcükleri ve karşıdakini ne kadar yaraladığını fark etmeye başladım.
And that they form a part of your, sort of language or everyday life that you didn't. I've started realizing how much that would have had an impact or hurt the person.
Dilimi değiştirmeye başladım.
I started changing my
Kendimle kavgam
vocabulary.
böyle başladı. O beynimizin kıvrımlarına yerleşmiş o milliyetçi ve ırkçı duygularla kavga etmeye başladım.
My struggle with myself started like that, and those, sort of things within me that had, sort of racial vilification stuff that I started struggling with and changing.
Yani önümde bir kapı açılmıştı.
That there was a new door open for me.
And I guess we can see here how important that work with the textbooks and with changing the history books and removing some of those terms, whether subtle or gross, that meant discrimination would have been.
What was the question?
Well, yes.
Evet, kesinlikle. Kesinlikle azınlık haklarına yönelmem, ders kitaplarındaki bu ırkçı, ayrımcı ve düşmanlık içeren söylemlerle mücadelem hep anneannemin öykülerinden sonra oldu.
All the stuff that I did was after my grandmother's story, like looking at the discriminative words in the, sort of the educational books, and looking at, sort of all working with human rights, with minorities, all started after that.
Yeah. I think that the way Cetin writes about the event itself is very powerful, but very lean and spare. I think it's one of the impressive qualities of the book, and it just tells the story very, very straight. And it is a terrible story of how a young girl is kidnapped or abducted from her mother, and yet she came to love the Turkish soldier or officer that kidnapped her and became her father, and never seemed to say a bad word about him. How do you see that?
Evet, anneannemi evlatlık olarak alan bir jandarma onbaşısı. Bu çocuğu olmayan biriymiş.
The jandarma who adopted my grandmother, sort of didn't have any children or couldn't have any children.
Şimdi bunu ben de hep çok düşündüm ve nasıl açıklarım diye.
This a lot.
Çünkü anneannem 9 yaşında bir kız çocuğu, o zamana kadar jandarma ile karşılaşmasında jandarma hep bir olumsuz figür olarak karşısına çıkmış.
My grandmother was 9 years old, and up until 9 years old, the time that she would come across a jandarma would have negative, sort of impact on her.
Örneğin köyü basan jandarma, köyün ortasında muhtarı öldüren jandarma.
Jandarma was the one that who raided their village. Sort of jandarma was the one that who killed the village leader.
Köyün bütün erkeklerini götüren jandarma.
The men, sort of village men that were removed from the village were by jandarmas.
Ve yollarda insanlar yürürken bir takım kötü davranışlarda bulunan yine jandarma.
And while the people were walking on their long walk, the bad things that was done to people were from jandarma.
Ve onu annesinden koparıp alan da bir jandarma.
And the person that who removed her from her mother was a jandarma.
Ama o jandarmayı anneannem çok seviyordu.
But my grandmother loved the jandarma who adopted her.
Çünkü o jandarma anneanneme çok sevgi ve şefkat göstermişti.
And because that jandarma who showed my grandmother a lot of love and affection.
Onu herhangi bir evlatlık, besleme gibi değil, gerçekten çocuğu gibi sevmişti.
It wasn't just, sort of looking after an orphan child. The jandarma loved my grandmother as his own child.
Ve anneannem ondan söz ederken babam derdi.
When my grandmother was, sort of talking about the jandarma, she would refer to him as her father.
Ama jandarmanın karısından bahsederken asla annem demedi. Onun için Esma Hanım derdi.
But never refer to jandarma's wife as a mother. Would always refer to her as Esma, Mrs. Esma.
Çünkü Esma Hanım anneanneme çok kötü davranmış.
Because Esma treated my mum very badly.
Orada sevginin gücünü hissediyor insan. Sanıyorum o sevgi, şefkat ve jandarmanın da aslında tüm yaşananlardan duyduğu rahatsızlık bu iki insan arasında böyle bir dayanışma oluşturmuş.
It is my understanding that the love was the strong bond and the power here. This is why that, sort of all that other events did not play between these two.